starting to formulate this thought after what Mark said. Because I've been in doing this kind of work for such a long period of time, I've heard that speech so many times. And I think for a lot of organizations, I think the nonprofit mentality is often a victim mentality. And we have heard all these smarter than us people telling us how to do our job. You know, market better, fundraise better, do less with more, do more with less, do less with less, whatever the saying is. I think many of us feel at this moment like, I'm sorry, I have cut all the fat out of my organization. I have stopped doing all the things I can stop doing without losing my core sense of who I am and what I'm about as an organization. So if you're telling me that the revenue is going to keep going this way, then I have to reinvent myself in some way, my organization, in some way that is more complex and more sophisticated than simply, you know, inventorying what I'm doing and cutting out the things that I can stop doing. I totally hear you about the busyness thing. We have that conversation in our organization all the time because we are 50 passionate, committed people who can't stop generating ideas, thank you very much, and can't stop trying to find ways to implement them and get them done. We can't stop ourselves, even though we know it keeps, you know, so it's not about being busy, it's really about this commitment to what it is we're about. So yes, the discipline of taking that, but I think we're at a moment that requires something more than just that. I think it's a moment that says, well, what are we about really, and how are we going to make that happen?
Yeah, I don't want to be glib about suggesting that, oh, well, you know, looking at your balance sheet, it seems like you're spending a lot on postage. You can probably cut that down and spend it more on paying dances. You know, that's every organization, profit or non-profit, will have to make their own decisions about what they can do. I think the question is that point you just made about the existential question. What are you here to do? And then how do you do it? And how do you make difficult choices in any economy so that you can do that work most effectively? And if the equation always leads to go to the same small set of people to give me money, whether that's funders or individual donors or a public agency or a city grant from the city or state or federal government, okay, that works so long as those people are still going to give you money. I think we're looking around, and I'm sure the conversation this afternoon about crowdsourcing, about new business models, et cetera, would say, wait a second, not only was that maybe never really the case, that there was just, you know, somebody on the corner handing out checks for every artist that wanted it, or social service organization, or educational institution, or any other environmental organization, but that doesn't seem to be the way the world is going. And any of you who've had a difficult conversation with your primary funders, certainly with us at Hewlett, know that our funding is going down. And public funding for the arts is going down. And so that equation, which ended up with a sense, here's all the things we want to do, here are all the things we're doing, the input here is going to come from this set of usual suspects. You know, A is the question of in what cases was that ever really going to work? And then comes the more maybe sobering assessment, like, well, what did we mean by it working? If it meant that we get to a point where we're earning $35K and eating Cheerios, and yet we're doing the work we want to be doing, okay, fine. That's absolutely valid and can be thought of as success, and that's an individual choice, and I don't want to be pejorative about it. And, you know, again, when we do our research, when we ask people, and this is a generational difference about why you got into this field and what your expectations were, people who got into the field in the 1970s and 1980s, it looks very much like people who went to do missionary work. You know, that this is a religious thing, and that's fine. Talk to people who got into it in the 90s and 2000s, and that's a little bit less the case. This work-life balance piece starts to enter it. These other values start to enter it. The expectation starts to enter it. So 35K in Cheerios isn't going to work. So then you go back to that formula that says what is underpinning the way we do our work. And that's, I think, what motivates the suggestion that you look, one, at what can you cut because it's inefficient and a waste of time, and that's always got to be part of the discussion. but more on a deeper level, what are you trying to do, and how much thinking have you done about the strategy to get there? And strategy is simply using the resources you have to get what you want. So account for the resources you have, identify what you want, then figure out how to get from A to B. And maybe it's about meeting people you haven't yet met because you don't have entree, whether it's, whether it's through a third-party entity that can bring people together, which the Hub is good at doing, or maybe there's another strategy. Maybe it is about engaging social media technology to meet people across the planet that you're not going to meet if you just sit in your office waiting for somebody to come through the door with a big check for you. But I just ask one question, I guess, Alex, about this two-way street dichotomy that you've set up is very true, but I actually think that there are people, and again, it's not and I'm sure this is on both cases, but there are nonprofit organizations, and I know ones in the arts better than other fields, working in communities that have historically never had much capital in them, doing work for underserved people. And I think those barriers to capital, those barriers to investment, those barriers to, hey, we've got something good here, and it's not an idea, it's not like theoretical, it's happening. Who's paying attention to that, and what steps are they making to come and see it in our neighborhood, as opposed to us going? And maybe that's part of it, but I think, whether we start to get into conversations about equity and all sorts of other ways in which our society fragments people, I think there has this tension, and I'm a little skeptical about, and I know you're not saying that this is easy, but I think the concept is still maybe to be proven a little bit about how far we can go down the path of saying, yeah, the double bottom line mentality really can work.
I think that there are two things here. One is create a business that actually just directly the business itself, for profit or nonprofit, like inherently does good. Like Kiva, right? Although the impact is an interesting question that Kiva deals with. The second piece is create a business that generates value, and off of that creates wealth, and then off of that wealth it funds something, right? And that third party system is like kind of what we're talking about like writing grants and having somebody. But it could be a grant maker that's very far away that you fill out, you go through some sort of level of bureaucracy to get access to the funding, or it could be something you is built into your business. And specifically, I worked in like Kenya and Uganda and India where there wasn't public funding. So what did people do when they didn't have funding for an orphanage? They needed money, and there's no money out there. What do? You create a business that funds the orphanage, right? So you create a bakery beside the orphanage, and the staff workers actually sell the goods, make the goods, and people want to buy those goods from that place because they know the money is going to the orphanage, right? In the same way that like microfinance has been this like panacea excitement, partly because it's just been a re-experience of a community bank where the wealth that comes from the community through the transactionary nature of the bank is reinvested in the community, right? Very simple notion of like the origins of what a bank is pre like Bank of America, and people are like, oh, this is what actually like how a community can function economically. So similarly, like we're kind of faced with a similar challenge, and I would say like we need to very much again look at just revenue structure. If you've got an economy that's doing this in a funding structure that's doing this, you got to look for alternative ways. And the best way that I've found to like find alternative ways generally is to like get out of this country and learn how like other cultures are doing it. It's fascinating. I mean, I learned the notion of community not through living in Western civilization. So as far as if you need different forms of revenue, you got to think much broader, right? And be exposed to much broader and think like, what's a for-profit revenue structure that we could wrap into this? And I think I keep bringing up intersection of the arts because I enjoy that, but there's so much vision in that organization. There's so many amazing ideas that haven't popped up because they're not thinking yet on let's create for-profit businesses that fund this whole thing, right? They're fundraising, they're grant writing, that sort of stuff. But there's so many different business ideas. There's so monetizable, God forbid we say that could fund an enormous amount of stuff that inherently doesn't drive direct revenue. Because there's a tremendous amount of stuff in the nonprofit industry that we're doing that doesn't have the ability to drive revenue, like an orphanage or a soup kitchen or something like that. So that's sexy,
So let me just say how
agree with you, particularly at this moment in time. You know, the symphony, opera, ballet are the Bank of Americas of our industry. And those are not models that are gonna last. There just aren't. It's so this whole like restructuring and rethinking about that, I guess the one piece I just really wanna like I'm obviously very passionate about this, is like, it's not our fault. And we're not the problem, we're the solution. And we need to get out from under being the problem and become part of the solution. And you emerging leaders, like, can, you know, be on the forefront of that in terms of generating creative new ideas that acknowledge the way the world has changed in the nonprofit structure, the way we know it, and some of us have grown up in it. That's not our future. So we have to figure out something else. And so the kinds of things that you're talking about, I think, are fascinating, but they are also really on the edge and experimental and pushing things. A lot of you I don't know about you, but certainly I'm in an institution, even in our institution, it's a struggle. It's a struggle to embrace that in the way that we need to.
Can I, sorry, okay.
So, this is really interesting. I think it's fascinating that conversation about people has quickly gone to conversation about business models, conversation about the economy, but I think it's all very closely connected, and I figured this might happen. So I do want to leave time for questions, and I see people kind of anxious to already get popped in. So this wasn't my initial plan, but we've talked for quite some time and covered a lot of actually the topics that I had on my list. So why don't we go ahead and toss it to the crowd, because I see some